The forgotten soldiers who fought a war their country denied. The post-war world, 1950s and 1960s, the shadow of the superpower. The Cold War was defined by a terrifying contradiction. The two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were too powerful to fight directly, yet too ideologically opposed to coexist peacefully. The result was a chilling game of proxy conflict, fought in the shadows, on distant continents, and through the lives of soldiers who were never supposed to exist. Officially, their country insisted there was no war, no deployment, no casualties. This denial was a strategic necessity. To admit to direct military engagement would have triggered the alliances, NATO or the Warsaw Pact, and risked escalating every minor skirmish into a potential global, nuclear confrontation. Therefore, the conflicts were fought by advisors, technical specialists, and military experts. In reality, they were infantry, pilots, and artillerymen, young men sent thousands of miles from home to fight and die in a full-scale, grinding conflict that, on paper, never happened. But thousands of young soldiers remembered otherwise. They carried the memory of the war in their nightmares, in the scars they couldn't explain, and in the faces of the friends who simply vanished from the official records. The journey into oblivion. The deployment began with an air of theatrical secrecy, designed to psychologically isolate the soldiers and enforce the silence that was their first and last weapon. They remembered the night trains with blacked-out windows. The soldiers were gathered at remote, often abandoned military bases under the cover of darkness. They were stripped of their standard-issue identification, unit patches, even personalized cigarette lighters. They were issued unmarked, gray uniforms, sanitized of any national insignia or rank. They became walking ghosts, ready to dissolve into the local population or the chaos of battle without leaving a trace of their origin. The sealed orders were terrifyingly vague, often delivered just hours before departure. They contained no geographical coordinates, no clear chain of command outside of their immediate officers, and absolutely no mention of the enemy they were about to face. The paper itself was designed to be instantly combustible. A few flickers of a match and the entire mission profile was gone. The uniforms with no insignia, the final, chilling confirmation of their status. These blank uniforms were a clear message: you are expendable, and you are officially non-existent. If captured, there would be no Geneva Convention protection, no prisoner exchanges, and no diplomatic pressure applied for their release. They were mercenaries without pay, soldiers of fortune without glory, and the promise, which was really a threat, was spoken only once, by a high-ranking intelligence officer who never looked them in the eye. If anything happens, if you are killed, or if you are captured, your families will never be told the truth. You will be listed as missing in service during a training exercise, or perhaps simply administratively discharged. There will be no flag, no hero's pension, and no explanation. Your duty is to your country's safety, and that demands absolute silence, even in death. These men fought, fled, and died in a conflict their own government refused to admit existed. They were ghost soldiers, sent into a war that officially didn't happen, fighting for strategic footholds in places that were, to their countrymen, just vague names on the evening news. The psychological toll was immense. They weren't just fighting the enemy, they were fighting the burden of absolute invisibility. Their bravery was private, their sacrifices were anonymous. Their entire existence in that distant jungle or cold desert was a state secret, perpetually under the threat of permanent erasure. The forgotten soldiers were deposited into operational theaters with the clinical precision of dropping a stone into a deep well. They often arrived by parachute drop or by small boats landing on remote, unpatrolled coasts, merging with the local landscape and military forces. They weren't given a country to defend because the fight wasn't about land, it was about ideology, proxy battle for global influence. They weren't defending the border of their own nation, but the border between capitalism and communism, a line drawn in blood across a foreign map. They weren't given rules of engagement based on international treaties. Their rules were simple, brutal, and locally defined: survival and silence. They operated under the command of local indigenous forces, serving as the technical backbone, the strategic mind, and the shock troops when needed. All they were told was, hold the line, and if you're captured, we do not know you. This final, terrifying directive became their creed. It meant carrying a suicide capsule to avoid interrogation and meticulously removing any evidence of their foreign origin from the bodies of their fallen comrades. It meant fighting not just for victory, but for the anonymity of the fallen. The invisible battlefield. Their battlefield wasn't marked on any map recognized by the United Nations. It was a stretch of mountains and villages, the highlands of Laos, the deserts of Yemen, the dense jungles of the Congo, where two rival powers were fighting a proxy war, equipping, training, and directing opposing sides, but denying any direct involvement to the world. For the Forgotten Soldiers, it meant an existence defined by endless patrols under the crushing weight of foreign heat and constant humidity, watching the jungle canopy for the flicker of an enemy rifle. The patrols were less about securing territory and more about proving a presence, projecting power where no official power was allowed to be. It meant sudden ambushes, attacks that materialized out of nothing, executed by local forces trained and equipped by the opposing superpower. These were not pitched battles of conventional armies, but brutal, close-quarters encounters where the objective was to kill quickly and vanish faster. The speed and intensity of these firefights, often lasting only minutes, made them chaotic and deadly. It meant firefights that were never recorded. If a battle lasted for 3 hours, resulting in dozens of casualties, the official military logs would simply show a day of routine technical maintenance, or training exercises. The casualties were written off as heat stroke, accidental discharges, or even desertion. The official history of the conflict remained pristine, while the ground truth was soaked in the blood of these ghost soldiers. The consequences of this denial were multifaceted and psychologically crippling. Every victory was unacknowledged. They fought fiercely for strategic hills, crucial bridges, or key communication hubs. They won battles that saved the lives of their local allies and shifted the political balance in the region. Yet, they returned to camp to no praise, no medals, and no official mention of their heroism. The reward was silence. The mission was its own secret. Every loss was erased. A soldier killed in action did not get a letter sent home to his parents explaining his valor. His name was simply removed from the roster. The official story would later circulate. He was transferred, he quit, he became unreliable. The families were left with an unexplained absence, a wound that never quite healed because there was no official closure, no recognition of their son's final sacrifice. The existence of these forgotten soldiers was a direct result of the nuclear stalemate. They were the cheap, deniable cost of avoiding World War III. They were the essential element of the Cold War's geometry, the line of scrimmage that had to remain invisible. Their war had no name, their deaths had no monument, and their service remained the greatest, most profound secret their governments ever kept. The only acknowledgement they received was the haunted look in the eyes of the men who survived alongside them, the Forgotten Soldiers, a composite, 20-man detachment primarily composed of hardened signals specialists, forward observers, and a light infantry corps, were dug in on a miserable ridge designated Firebase Omega. Their mission was static: monitor enemy logistics passing through the valley below and ensure the local Allied forces maintained control of a strategic crossroads. It was meant to be boring. It was supposed to be a patrol base, not a fortress. For 6 weeks, the war had been fought by skirmishes, snipers, and the crackle of small arms fire. It was a jungle war of attrition, fought with Alaska 47s against M16s, a brutal, low-tech conflict perfectly suited for denial. But one night, everything changed. It was 2 o'clock hours. The air was thick with the scent of monsoon dampness and decaying vegetation. The first warning was not a rifle shot, but a sound that belonged to a different war entirely. The deep, resonant thump of heavy artillery, followed seconds later by the terrifying, whistling approach of incoming shells. A coordinated enemy offensive hit their sector with overwhelming force. The enemy, until now, a ragged, elusive guerrilla force, had suddenly transformed into a mechanized, professional army. The barrage was precise, sustained, and directed by skilled forward observers. This wasn't local. This was the work of a superpower's military guidance. Mortars followed instantly, raining down on the flimsy earthworks of Firebase Omega. The soldiers, jolted awake by the earth-shattering percussion, scrambled into their shallow foxholes, the soil vibrating beneath them like a drum's skin. But the true horror materialized on the trail below, where the sound of churning diesel engines and grinding metal confirmed the impossible. Armored vehicles that weren't supposed to be there. Heavy Soviet-made T-34 tanks, supplied by the enemy's mysterious patron and manned by local crews guided by embedded foreign technicians, were churning through the jungle mud, their silhouettes massive and menacing in the flashes of the explosions. The enemy was using an iron hammer where they had previously used a surgical scalpel. The arrival of armor meant the rules of engagement had been brutally rewritten. The Forgotten Soldiers, equipped only with light machine guns, anti-tank rockets of questionable vintage, and sheer stubbornness, were now staring down a tank column supported by a full regiment of infantry. For 14 hours, the Forgotten Soldiers held their position, a desperate, brutal, and utterly heroic stand. They were cut off, their radios failing in the barrage, their position untenable. Their entire world shrank to the 6-foot length of their trenches, the muzzle flash of their rifles, and the constant need to feed the hungry belt of the M60 machine gun. The battle raged through the night and into the cruel daylight. Every man fought with the primal knowledge that defeat meant not just death, but disappearance. They ran low on water, low on medical supplies, and critically, running out of ammunition. The jungle around them was stripped bare by high explosives, a nightmare landscape of splintered wood and upturned earth. The one-way conversation, the frantic radio messages transmitted from Firebase Omega became a desperate, unilateral plea into the strategic void. Sergeant Elias Call, the last surviving radio operator, worked his hand crank until his arm cramped, trying to punch through the jamming and the atmospheric interference. His voice, raw and cracked, was relayed high into the troposphere, picked up by a distant, silent monitoring post thousands of miles away. Foxtrot Omega, we are under heavy attack, sustained armored and artillery fire. Repeat. We need reinforcements. Requesting immediate air support, grid coordinates 4 to 7 Alpha. Silence. Only static and the echo of his own voice. Our casualties are heavy. The enemy is consolidating their position. We can hold for another hour, maybe less. Does anyone copy? Call knew the procedure. He was transmitting on a scrambled, black market frequency used only for emergency intelligence relay. He was not talking to a field commander, he was talking directly to a desk in a darkened room, likely in Washington or Langley. But headquarters didn't respond. They couldn't, because answering meant admitting the war existed. To acknowledge that a regiment of enemy forces, supplied with tanks and artillery, was fighting a 20-man Western team in that specific valley meant officially confirming a direct military intervention, tearing apart the delicate veil of plausible deniability that kept the entire Cold War from boiling over. The high-ranking officer listening thousands of miles away, a man insulated by soundproof walls and layers of classification, was faced with an impossible moral choice: save 20 brave men, or save the political stability of the globe. The political stability won. The radio silence from friendly forces was the most agonizing weapon the forgotten soldiers faced. It confirmed their ultimate, terrifying isolation. Their country had not forgotten them, it had deliberately disowned them in the moment of their greatest need. For 14 hours, they were completely alone, fighting a battle that, to the rest of the world, was merely the sound of the wind. The retreat and the burial of the dead the morning after. As the sun finally burned through the heavy jungle mist, the intensity of the enemy fire began to slacken. The enemy, having secured the valley and suffering heavy losses from the desperate defense, consolidated its gains and moved on, leaving Firebase Omega a smoking ruin. When the smoke cleared, the devastation was absolute. Of the 20-man detachment, 6 were dead, ripped apart by shrapnel or crushed by the armored assault. 7 more were severely wounded, their broken bodies testament to the prolonged, brutal defense. The survivors, just 7 men untouched by major wounds, their faces black with soot and exhaustion, their uniforms shredded, retreated. The command to retreat was given by the ranking non-commissioned officer, Sergeant Morales, his voice hoarse with dust and shock. The retreat was agonizingly slow. They moved through ravines, thick with mud and hidden enemy snipers, carrying the wounded on makeshift stretchers fashioned from rifle slings and ponchos. Every step was a trial of endurance. They carried their living burdens, but also the impossible weight of their dead comrades' invisibility. They couldn't leave the bodies. To do so would risk their capture and the exposure of the entire project. They carried the dead, stripped of every recognizable personal item, for 3 tortuous days, until they reached the agreed-upon extraction point EP, a remote, abandoned airstrip. When they finally returned to base, a clandestine staging area tucked away in a remote allied nation, exhausted and physically broken, they expected recognition. They expected the immediate medical attention, the fresh rations, and the official commendation for holding the line against overwhelming odds. They expected a report, a debriefing, anything to acknowledge the raw, terrifying reality they had just survived. Instead, they were met by a team of unmarked, uniformed officers, colder and more sterile than the medical tent. There were no emotional embraces, no kind words, only immediate, clinical processing. The soldiers were physically stripped of every piece of equipment they had used in the fight. Officers collected their weapons, the uniforms, the blood-soaked bandages, and the melted remains of their helmets. All evidence of the battle was systematically, quietly, vacuumed up. Then, the final, crushing psychological blow. The senior intelligence officer, a man with steel-gray eyes who spoke in clipped, emotionless tones, quietly said the 4 words that summarized their entire forgotten service. You were never there. Nothing happened. The sheer, administrative cruelty of the denial was more painful than any wound. Their battle was not a triumph of courage, it was a paperwork error. Their sacrifices were not heroic, they were irrelevant. They were debriefed not for strategic intelligence, but for administrative housekeeping, to ensure that every single piece of information, every memory, was sanitized and logged away. The families of the dead were told their sons died in training accidents, a jeep crash, a faulty parachute, a grenade drill gone wrong. These lies were precise, crafted to prevent suspicion and to give the families just enough official closure to stop them from asking too many questions. Some received no explanation at all. Their sons were simply listed as discharged due to unsuitability, or missing, presumed deserted. For those families, the pain was compounded by shame, leaving them with a void where their son should have been, and a national rejection of his memory. The survivors of Firebase Omega carried two burdens: the physical trauma of the battle and the silent, heavy shame of the institutional denial. They had fought a war for their country's safety, and their country's only response was to erase their existence. They became the living ghosts of a battle no one reported, a terrifying testament to the price of maintaining the delicate, violent peace of the Cold War. The immediate aftermath of the war was defined by absolute, official amnesia. The survivors of Firebase Omega, and hundreds like them who fought in the various, denied theaters, of the Cold War, from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, were repatriated, often under cover of night, and quietly folded back into civilian life or routine administrative postings. They were given new identities, new paperwork, and a lifetime non-disclosure agreement that hung over their heads like a guillotine blade. For decades, the official narrative held firm. The governments, East and West, maintained the perfect illusion of non-involvement, ensuring the history books remained clean. The men who fought were forced to live a double life, a quiet citizen on the surface, and a combat veteran haunted by ghosts underneath. They couldn't seek medical help for the trauma, because the trauma had no official origin. They couldn't mourn their friends publicly, because their friends had died in a phantom war. But history, like water, always finds the cracks. As the Cold War wound down, and as political tides shifted in the 1990s and 2000s, the rigid walls of classification began to crumble. Governments changed hands, security protocols loosened, and a wave of classified documents began to leak, first as whispers, then as undeniable proof. The leaks confirmed the soldiers' whispered truths. The evidence of erasure. The first solid proof came in the form of intercepted radio logs. These were not the frantic outgoing messages from Firebase Omega, which had been instantly classified, but the meticulous, archived transcripts from the distant monitoring posts. These logs contained the raw, desperate pleas, the grid coordinates, the requests for air support, the frantic reports of armored columns. They proved that headquarters had heard the cries for help, analyzed the threat, and made the conscious, strategic decision to hang up the phone. The logs bore the classification stamp: action denied, maintain plausible deniability. It was a cold, clinical sentence of death for their comrades. Next came the medical reports from field hospitals. These facilities, secretly established near the denied theaters, were known internally as clean rooms. When a ghost soldier was too injured to be treated discreetly at the staging base, they were flown here, where doctors and nurses were forced to operate under extraordinary secrecy. The reports documented wounds consistent with heavy combat, shrapnel from 152mm artillery shells, severe burns from tank fire, and rifle wounds inconsistent with standard training exercises. Crucially, the records were all coded. Instead of names, they used numbers, and instead of describing a firefight, the cause of injury was invariably listed as vehicular accident or exposure. Yet, the forensic detail of the injuries, logged by ethical, albeit silenced, doctors, pointed to the inescapable conclusion: full-scale warfare. The ghosts on film. Perhaps the most visceral evidence came from photos taken by soldiers who weren't supposed to have cameras. Despite the strict prohibitions, many of the men, knowing their service would otherwise vanish, carried tiny, illicit cameras. These grainy, faded photographs, smuggled home in boot heels or sewn into uniform linings, showed the undeniable truth: not men on a pleasant training course, but men in combat. They captured the faces of the fallen just before their final patrol, the cramped, terrifying interiors of their bunkers, the silhouettes of enemy tanks breaching the perimeter, and the quiet, exhausted faces of the survivors retreating through the jungle. These photographs, once developed in secret bathrooms and kept under lock and key, were the true, human record of the war. And finally, the casualty lists with names blacked out. These were the master roster indexes, compiled in the deepest levels of the bureaucracy. They listed the true names and service numbers of the men who had been administratively discharged, or died in training. Next to their names was a column for actual cause of death, or operational status. Here, the coded truth was revealed. Kia, hostile fire, 0200 hours, grid 4 to 7 alpha. But the names themselves were meticulously redacted, masked by heavy black ink or crossed out with a marker, a government-mandated erasure, ensuring that the living administrative history matched the fake public record. Each piece pointed to the same devastating truth: there was a war. Their country simply erased it. The forgotten soldiers had been used as expendable pieces in a conflict their leaders refused to acknowledge, the ultimate sacrifice of identity for the sake of Cold War politics. The files proved that the denial was not a mistake or an oversight, it was a deliberate, calculated, and highly effective strategy of state-sponsored historical revision. The War After the War, 2000s, present day breaking the silence. The declassification of documents provided the evidence, but it did not provide the justice. The government institutions that had initiated the denial were slow, resistant, and deeply reluctant to admit the scale of the deceit. The long war to gain recognition for these men became the war after the war. Decades passed before anyone truly listened. The survivors, now graying, walking with the stiffness of old wounds, and carrying the profound burden of their secret, were not content to let the file cabinets be the final resting place of their comrades' memories. Some survivors formed associations. They were small, informal groups at first, meetings in church basements or veterans' halls, sharing their secret histories with the only people who could truly understand. They gathered the grainy photographs, cross-referenced the vague casualty dates, and pieced together the fragments of their shared trauma. These associations became the collective memory bank, the unofficial archives of the denied war. They documented every single name, every true cause of death, and every lie told to the families. Others testified before journalists and historians. They stepped out of the shadows, breaking the silence of their lifetime non-disclosure agreements, risking their reputations and meager pensions. They spoke with the unwavering moral certainty of men who had seen the ultimate bureaucratic betrayal. Their stories, filled with vivid, painful detail, slowly began to enter the public consciousness, creating a groundswell of pressure on political leaders. A few spent their entire lives fighting for official recognition. Men like Sergeant Morales, who had led the retreat from Firebase Omega, became tireless advocates. They haunted the halls of government, wrote thousands of letters, and filed countless legal motions, demanding that the official record be corrected. They fought for the right of the dead to have their names read aloud, and for the right of the survivors to receive the medical care and veterans' benefits they were entitled to. They understood that the true cost of the war was not just the men lost, but the decades of dignity stolen from the men who returned. The final victory. The turning point was slow, measured in years rather than days. First came the quiet legislative amendments, the silent insertion of clauses into defense bills that allowed veterans of certain classified overseas deployments to receive limited benefits. Then came the establishment of special review boards, mandated to go through the blackened files and verify the truth. The final, symbolic recognition was the hardest one. It wasn't a sudden, grand gesture, but a slow, grudging admission. Memorials were finally dedicated, listing the names of the lost, names previously omitted, now etched forever in stone. Today, we finally know their story, not because their country told it, because the mechanism of state denial was too powerful and too effective for that, but because the soldiers themselves refused to let their comrades disappear. Their refusal to surrender the truth was their final, and most meaningful, act of courage. They fought a war the world wasn't supposed to know about, a war their nation denied. They were asked to sacrifice everything, including their own memory. But they remembered the blacked-out trains, the sealed orders, the 14 hours of terror at Firebase Omega, and the brutal silence that followed. They carried the memory for the families who were told lies, and for the comrades whose files were scrubbed clean. And now, because of their relentless, decades-long fight for truth, so do we. Their story is no longer a footnote in a classified archive, but a testament to the fact that even the most powerful governments cannot ultimately erase the truth of men who fought and died with honor.